Picture the moment when your day finally goes quiet. The lights are low, the phone is face down. The world outside your window has softened into stillness. And yet, your mind keeps moving. Not with urgency, not with panic, just circling. Have you ever noticed that the quieter the room becomes, the louder your thoughts seem to grow? Not about tomorrow's tasks or yesterday's mistakes, something deeper. A question you can't quite name. What if none of it means anything? Not in a catastrophic way. Not in a way that demands action. Just nothing. A kind of vertigo that arrives when you stop long enough to look down and realize there's no ground beneath the ground. You're not broken for feeling this. You're not failing at peace. You're noticing something that philosophers have been noticing for thousands of years. The possibility that meaning is not woven into the fabric of existence. That it's something we drape over the world to keep from seeing what's underneath. Nothingness. Tonight, we're going to walk through that possibility together. Not to make you more anxious. Not to tear anything down. But to understand what happens when the mind brushes up against the idea that there is no ultimate purpose, no cosmic plan, no inherent value written into the stars, and more importantly, what that realization does to the body, to sleep, to the nervous system that spends so much energy searching for answers that may not exist. This is not a lecture. It's a slow descent, a guided drift through one of philosophy's most misunderstood traditions. Nihilism, the belief in nothing. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why certain thoughts return at night, why the mind rehearses meaning even when it suspects meaning is absent, and why, strangely, confronting nothingness can sometimes bring more peace than chasing certainty ever did. So let your body settle where it rests. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. And as you listen, you don't have to do anything, just notice. Because there are two kinds of emptiness. One that destroys, and one that liberates. We're going to explore both. And by the time we reach the end, you'll know which one has been calling to you in the quiet hours. Let's begin. Chapter 2, Meaning and its Collapse. Most of us don't question meaning until it's already gone. We wake up, we go through the motions, we organize our days around goals, relationships, routines, and underneath it all, there's an assumption, an invisible scaffolding holding everything together. The assumption is simple. This matters, not just in a personal way, in a real way. A way that would still be true even if you weren't there to believe it. But then something shifts. Maybe it's gradual, a slow erosion over months or years, where the things you used to care about start feeling hollow. The promotion you work toward doesn't bring satisfaction. The relationship you fought for doesn't feel like home. The hobbies, the plans, the achievements, they all start to feel like elaborate distractions from a truth you're not ready to face. Or maybe it's sudden, a loss, a betrayal, a single conversation that pulls the thread and unravels everything. And you're left standing in the wreckage, asking the question you've been avoiding. What was the point of any of this? Not rhetorically, not as a passing mood, as a genuine inquiry. What if there is no point? This is the collapse of meaning, and it doesn't announce itself with trumpets or drama. It's quiet, a slow leak in the architecture of belief. Philosophers call this the nihilistic crisis. But it's not just a philosophical problem, it's a bodily one. Your nervous system was built to seek patterns, to construct narratives, to find coherence in chaos. When meaning collapses, the body doesn't know what to do. It keeps searching. It keeps rehearsing. It keeps replaying scenarios, conversations, choices, trying to find the through line that makes sense of it all. But the through line is missing, and that absence becomes its own kind of presence. A weight, a restlessness, a background hum of existential static that follows you into the night. Here's what most people don't realize. The collapse of meaning isn't a mistake. It's not evidence that you're depressed or broken or thinking wrong. It's evidence that you're awake, that you're seeing past the stories we tell to keep the world comfortable. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So the question becomes, what do you do with that sight? Do you rebuild meaning from scratch, knowing it's arbitrary? Do you let the nothingness wash over you until you stop fighting it? Or do you live in the tension between the two, never fully landing anywhere? These aren't abstract choices. They're the foundation of how you sleep, how you rest, how you move through the world when the world stops making sense on its own terms. And this is where the real journey into nihilism begins. Not as a rejection of life, but as a confrontation with the fact that life doesn't come preloaded with instructions. The meaning you've been searching for? It was never out there. It was always something you were doing. And the moment you stop doing it, the world becomes quiet. Not hostile, not cruel, just quiet. And in that quiet, something ancient begins to stir. A philosophical tradition that has been naming this collapse for centuries. Let's go back to where it started. Chapter 3, Origins of Nihilistic Thought. Nihilism didn't begin with Nietzsche. It didn't begin with modernity or science or the death of God. It began the moment someone looked at the world and asked, what if this is all there is? No heaven, no justice, no cosmic narrative rewarding virtue or punishing vice. Just this. The earliest traces of nihilistic thought show up in ancient India in the teachings of the Carvaka school. Around 600 BCE, while other philosophers were building elaborate metaphysical systems, the Carvakas said, stop. Stop inventing invisible realms to justify suffering. Stop pretending there's a moral order written into the fabric of reality. Stop postponing happiness for some imagined afterlife. There is only this body, this breath, this moment. And when it ends completely. No soul, no reincarnation, no karmic ledger balancing debts across lifetimes. Just dust returning to dust. It wasn't pessimism. It was a kind of radical honesty. A refusal to comfort the mind with stories that couldn't be proven. The Carvakas were dismissed as hedonists, as dangerous thinkers who would unravel the social fabric. Because if there's no cosmic justice, why be good? If there's no punishment after death, why not take whatever you want? But that's not what the Carvakas taught. They taught something quieter. That morality doesn't need a divine author to be real. That kindness doesn't require a cosmic audience to be meaningful. That you can live well without needing the universe to validate your choices. This is the first seed of nihilism, not as destruction, but as liberation from false certainty. Across the ancient world, similar thoughts were surfacing. In Greece, the skeptics were dismantling knowledge itself. In China, Zhuangzi was pointing to the emptiness at the heart of all distinctions. And in each tradition, the same pattern emerged. A moment when someone stopped building elaborate systems and simply said, "I don't know," and "I don't need to know." This not knowing became its own kind of wisdom, not a wisdom that promised answers, but a wisdom that released the grip, that stopped demanding the world be other than it is. Fast forward to 18th century Europe. The word nihilism first appears in philosophical discourse, not as a celebration, but as an accusation, a term thrown at thinkers who questioned the foundations of Christianity, monarchy, moral absolutes. It was meant as an insult, a way of saying, "You're tearing down everything sacred and offering nothing in return." But here's the small detail that changes it. The thinkers accused of nihilism weren't trying to destroy the world. They were trying to see it clearly. They were asking, what remains when we strip away inherited belief? What's left when we stop pretending we know things we don't? And the answer kept coming back the same. Nothing. Not nothing as in despair. Nothing as in spaciousness. A clearing where something new might grow. Because nihilism, at its root, is not a philosophy of endings. It's a philosophy of honesty. It says, if the meaning you've been defending is borrowed, inherited, unexamined, let it go. See what's underneath. And if there's nothing underneath, then at least you're standing on solid ground. Even if that ground is emptiness, this is the foundation, the quiet rebellion that runs through every nihilistic tradition, and it's about to meet its most famous voice. But before we get there, we need to understand the architecture it was dismantling, the structure of belief that had held the Western world together for centuries, and what happened when that structure began to crack. Chapter 4, Ancient Skepticism Revisited. Let's go back even further, to a group of thinkers who didn't call themselves nihilists, but laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The ancient skeptics. Around 300 BCE, a philosopher named Pyrrho returned from a military campaign in India with a question that would haunt Western philosophy for millennia. How do you know anything for certain? Not as a rhetorical trick, as a genuine inquiry. You believe the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has. But that's not certainty. That's habit. You believe your senses show you reality. But your senses have been wrong before. Dreams feel real until you wake. You believe in moral truths, that some actions are objectively good, others objectively bad. But different cultures have different morals. Different eras have different values. So where does certainty come from? Pyrrho's answer was unsettling. It doesn't. Every belief you hold rests on another belief. Every argument depends on premises you can't prove. Dig deep enough and you hit bedrock that's just assumed. And if the foundation is assumed, then everything built on top of it is uncertain. This wasn't meant to paralyze people. It was meant to free them. Pyrrho called it ataraxia, a state of unshakable calm that comes from releasing the need to be right. When you stop clinging to certainty, the world stops threatening you. You can hold beliefs lightly. You can change your mind without losing your identity. You can let contradictions exist without needing to resolve them immediately. It sounds abstract, but here's what it looks like in practice. Imagine someone cuts you off in traffic. Your first reaction is anger, outrage. They're wrong. They're rude. Wait, what if they didn't see you? What if they're rushing to the hospital? What if their concept of right in that moment was different from yours? The anger doesn't disappear, but it loses its certainty. And in that loss of certainty, there's space. Space to breathe, space to choose, space to let it go. This is the psychological gift of skepticism, not doubt for its own sake, but doubt as a tool for softening the grip. The skeptics took this further than most people were comfortable with. They questioned everything: the existence of gods, the nature of justice, the reliability of reason itself. And when pressed to defend their own position, they said, "We're not defending anything, we're just noticing that you can't prove what you claim to know." It drove their opponents mad, because how do you argue with someone who won't claim to be right? But here's the part most people overlook quietly. The skeptics weren't pessimists. They didn't retreat from life. They engaged with it fully, just without the armor of absolute conviction. They acted based on appearances, customs, practical necessity, but never pretended those actions were metaphysically justified. They ate when hungry. They helped their neighbors. They followed laws, not because the universe demanded it, but because it seemed reasonable in the moment, and that was enough. This is the pattern that runs through all forms of philosophical nihilism: a willingness to act without ultimate justification, a willingness to live without cosmic backing, a willingness to say, "I don't know why I'm here, but I'm here, so I might as well be kind." It's not despair, it's humility, and it's the foundation for what comes next. Because skepticism clears the ground. It removes the false certainties, the inherited dogmas, the unexamined structures. And once the ground is clear, you can start to see what you're actually dealing with. Not meaning imposed from above, but meaning or its absence arising from the confrontation between consciousness and a universe that offers no instructions. And that confrontation becomes urgent in a particular historical moment. When the largest meaning-making structure in Western history begins to fracture, let's turn there now. Chapter 5: Faith, God, and Absence. For over 1,000 years, one story held the Western world together. God created the universe. Humanity fell. Christ redeemed. And at the end of time, justice would prevail. It wasn't just a religious belief. It was the framework for meaning itself. Your suffering wasn't random. It was a test. Your actions weren't arbitrary. They were being recorded. Your life wasn't insignificant. It was part of a cosmic drama with eternal consequences. Every question had an answer, even if that answer was God's will. Every injustice had a resolution, even if that resolution waited until the afterlife. It was a complete system, totalizing, comforting, and for many people, absolutely true. But here's what happens when that system starts to crack. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small questions. If God is good, why does a child suffer? If God is just, why does cruelty go unpunished? If God is present, why does the world feel so absent of providence? At first, theology has answers. Suffering builds character. Free will requires the possibility of evil. Divine justice operates on a timescale we can't comprehend. But for some people, the answers stop satisfying. Not because they're looking for reasons to disbelieve, but because the gap between the promise and the experience becomes too wide to ignore. You pray for relief. Relief doesn't come. You live righteously. Righteousness doesn't protect you. You search for signs of divine presence. The silence is deafening, and slowly, quietly, a new thought begins to surface. What if God isn't silent because the answer is too complex for human understanding? What if God is silent because there's no one there to answer? This is the moment of absence. Not the absence of belief, but the absence of presence, the realization that the universe doesn't seem to be watching, that your prayers are dissolving into empty air, that the moral architecture you've been taught to trust is just a story, a beautiful story, a necessary story perhaps, but a story nonetheless. And once you see it as a story, you can't unsee it. This doesn't happen to everyone. Many people experience doubt and return to faith stronger. Many people find ways to hold belief and skepticism in tension. But for those who cross the threshold into absence, something fundamental shifts. The world doesn't become evil. It becomes indifferent, not hostile, not cruel, just indifferent. The tree that falls in the forest and kills a child, it's not punishment, it's physics. The disease that ravages a body, it's not a test, it's biology. The betrayal, the loss, the heartbreak, it's not part of a plan, it's just what happened. And this indifference is strangely difficult to metabolize, because the human mind craves narrative. It wants cause and effect. It wants meaning. It wants someone or something to be in control. Even if that control is terrifying, it's better than randomness. But here's the quiet layer beneath that. Randomness and indifference are only unbearable if you're still expecting providence, if you're still waiting for the universe to care. Once you stop waiting, something else becomes possible. Not joy, necessarily, but a kind of freedom. The freedom to stop asking, why me, and start asking, what now? The freedom to build your own meaning instead of inheriting it. The freedom to act without divine permission. This is the doorway nihilism walks through, not as a rejection of God out of anger, but as an acceptance that the universe, whether God exists or not, doesn't seem to be offering the certainty we were promised. And that acceptance has consequences. Philosophical consequences, psychological consequences, cultural consequences. Because when God becomes optional, so does everything built on the assumption of God's existence. Morality, purpose, identity, all of it suddenly floating. And one philosopher saw this moment coming before anyone else. He saw it with such clarity that his words still feel prophetic. Let's meet him now. Chapter 6. The Death of God. In 1882, a German philosopher published a passage that would become one of the most misunderstood sentences in Western thought. God is dead. 3 words. Not a celebration. Not an attack. Not a claim about theology. An observation. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't saying God never existed. He was saying that for most people in modern Europe, God had stopped functioning as the center of meaning. The churches were still standing. The rituals were still performed. But the psychological weight of divine authority, the sense that God was actively present, watching, judging, caring, had evaporated. And this wasn't because people had become wicked. It was because science, reason, and lived experience had slowly eroded the plausibility of the old story. Enlightenment thinkers had pulled threads from the theological fabric. Darwin had removed humanity from the center of creation. Historical criticism had shown the Bible to be a human document, written by people with agendas full of contradictions. And the world kept turning. Children still suffered. Wars still raged. Injustice still flourished. And the promised intervention never came. So people stopped believing, not dramatically, but gradually. They stopped expecting miracles. They stopped trusting in cosmic justice. They kept going to church out of habit, out of social obligation, but the inner fire had gone out. This is what Nietzsche meant by God is dead. Not that God had died in some cosmic event, but that the cultural confidence in God's existence and relevance had died. And here's the part that terrified Nietzsche. No one seemed to understand what they'd lost, because God wasn't just a belief in a supernatural being. God was the foundation for meaning, morality, purpose, identity. God was the answer to the question, why should I do anything at all? Take God away, and the question remains. But the answer disappears. So what happens next? Most people, Nietzsche said, would pretend nothing had changed. They'd keep using the language of morality without acknowledging they'd lost the metaphysical ground beneath it. They'd keep talking about right and wrong, good and evil, justice and duty, as if these concepts still had the weight of divine commandment behind them. But they don't. They're just preferences now, cultural habits, inherited reflexes. And this pretending, Nietzsche argued, was more dangerous than honest nihilism. Because honest nihilism at least sees the problem clearly. It says, the old foundations are gone. We need to figure out what comes next. But most people don't want to figure it out. They want to keep the comfort of moral certainty without the burden of metaphysical commitment. And that's the real crisis of modernity. Not that people stop believing in God, but that they stop believing in God without realizing they'd also stop believing in everything built on God. So Nietzsche issues a warning. We're entering an era of nihilism, an era where meaning collapses because the structure holding it up has been removed. And most people won't even notice until they're standing in the rubble wondering why nothing feels important anymore. Now, Nietzsche didn't stop there. He didn't just diagnose the problem. He tried to imagine a solution, a way forward, a way to create meaning in a world without divine authority. But before we get to that, we need to sit with the weight of what he's describing. Because God is dead, isn't just a statement about theology. It's a statement about you, about the moment when you realize the universe isn't going to hand you a purpose, that you're free, terrifyingly, devastatingly free to decide what matters. And that freedom is the heart of both nihilism's terror and its possibility. Let's explore that tension now. Chapter 7, Friedrich Nietzsche and Modern Nihilism. Nietzsche didn't want to be a nihilist. He spent his entire philosophical career fighting against it. But he understood nihilism better than almost anyone because he saw it as the inevitable consequence of honesty. If you're intellectually honest about the collapse of religious certainty, nihilism is where you land, at least temporarily. The question is, what do you do once you're there? Nietzsche saw two paths. One he called passive nihilism, the other active nihilism. Let's start with the passive version. Passive nihilism is what happens when you recognize that meaning is arbitrary and you collapse under the weight of that recognition. You stop trying. You stop caring. You drift through life in a kind of spiritual exhaustion, going through the motions but never fully engaging. Because what's the point? If nothing ultimately matters, why bother with effort, with relationships, with growth? Why not just coast? This is the nihilism of resignation, and it's quietly epidemic. You see it in people who are technically alive but not really living, who scroll endlessly through distractions because engagement feels too heavy, who avoid deep relationships because vulnerability seems pointless, who dismiss beauty, meaning, transcendence as naive illusions and then wonder why they feel so empty. Passive nihilism doesn't announce itself. It's a slow fade, a gradual loss of color, until one day you realize you've been living on autopilot for years, and the only reason you're still going is momentum. Nietzsche had contempt for this version of nihilism, not because the people experiencing it were weak, but because it's a waste of consciousness, a waste of possibility, a waste of the brief, improbable window you have to be here. But then there's the other path, active nihilism. This is where you confront the meaninglessness directly, and instead of collapsing, you decide to create meaning anyway. Not because the universe demands it, but because you can. Because consciousness, even in an indifferent universe, has the strange capacity to care, to value, to prefer, to commit. And that capacity doesn't disappear just because God does. Active nihilism says, fine, there's no cosmic purpose, no divine plan, no ultimate justification, but I'm still here, and I still have desires, projects, relationships that matter to me. So I'll pour my energy into those not because they're metaphysically important, but because they're mine. This isn't self-deception. It's a kind of existential defiance, a refusal to let the absence of cosmic meaning drain the vitality from human meaning. Nietzsche's most famous concept, the Übermensch, or overman, is the person who embodies this active nihilism, not a superhero, not someone who transcends humanity, but someone who creates their own values in the face of a valueless universe, someone who says, I will decide what's worthy of my devotion, and I won't apologize for the fact that my choice is arbitrary. Here's the thing most people misunderstand about Nietzsche. He's not telling you to become cruel or selfish. He's telling you to stop outsourcing your sense of worth to external authorities. To stop waiting for permission to care about what you care about. To stop pretending that your moral convictions are anything other than deeply personal commitments that you're willing to defend. And this requires a kind of honesty that most people find unbearable, because it means admitting, my values aren't universal. They're mine, and that's enough. Not because the universe agrees, but because I've decided they're worth fighting for. This is where nihilism stops being a philosophy of despair and starts being a philosophy of responsibility. Because if there's no God, no karma, no cosmic justice, then you're responsible. Not in a guilt-inducing way, in a liberating way. You're responsible for what you make of your life, for how you treat people, for what you create, for what you leave behind. And no one can take that responsibility from you by offering you a prefabricated purpose. Now, this sounds empowering, and for some people, it is. But for others, it's terrifying, because responsibility without guidance feels like drowning in possibility. How do you choose what to value when all values are equally groundless? How do you commit to anything when you know it's ultimately arbitrary? This is the paradox Nietzsche never fully resolved. And it's the paradox that keeps people awake at night, but there's a quieter truth underneath. Maybe the problem isn't that meaning is arbitrary. Maybe the problem is that we're still looking for meaning to be anything other than arbitrary. We're still waiting for the universe to tell us we're on the right path. And it won't. It can't. Because that's not what universes do. So the question becomes, can you live well without cosmic validation? Can you care deeply about things you know don't matter in any ultimate sense? Can you build a life worth living on foundations you know are made of sand? Nietzsche thought you could, but he also knew most people wouldn't want to. And that tension between the honest confrontation with meaninglessness and the human need for significance is where nihilism becomes not just a philosophy, but a lived experience. A daily negotiation between the void and the choices you make in spite of it. Let's keep going deeper. Chapter 8, Passive and Active Nihilism. Let's return to that distinction Nietzsche made, because it's not just theoretical. It's the difference between two very different ways of inhabiting a meaningless world. Passive nihilism is the easier path. It requires nothing from you. You just let go. You stop striving. You stop believing. You stop pretending that anything matters. And there's a certain relief in that, because striving is exhausting. Believing requires maintenance. Pretending takes energy. So passive nihilism becomes a kind of rest, a permanent rest. You watch other people chase goals, build careers, fall in love, and you see it all as theatre. Elaborate performances in a play with no audience. And you're not wrong, exactly. From a cosmic perspective, it is theatre. But here's the part passive nihilism misses. The absence of cosmic meaning doesn't make human meaning fake. It just makes it local, finite, fragile, and maybe that fragility is what makes it valuable. Imagine someone writes you a letter. They pour their heart into it. They choose every word carefully. They hand it to you with trembling hands because they're afraid you'll dismiss it. Now imagine someone says, "That letter doesn't matter. In 100 years, no one will remember it existed." They're right. But does that make the letter meaningless now? Or does the temporariness of the letter, the fact that it will one day turn to dust, somehow make it more precious? This is what passive nihilism can't see. It conflates not eternal with not real. But most of what makes life worth living is not eternal. A sunrise, a meal shared with someone you love, a moment of clarity after months of confusion. None of it lasts, and none of it needs to. Active nihilism understands this. It says, yes, nothing lasts. Yes, nothing has cosmic significance. And yet, I'm still here, and so are you. And between us, in this brief window, we can create something that matters to us. Not to the universe, to us. And that's a different kind of meaning. Not discovered, not revealed. Created, chosen, defended. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes almost unbearably personal, because it asks you to take responsibility for your own values without the comfort of believing they're objectively correct. It asks you to commit to things you can't prove are worth committing to. It asks you to care fiercely, deeply, unreasonably about things you know are ultimately insignificant. And that's hard. It's easier to be passive, to shrug and say, nothing matters, so why bother? But here's the cost of that passivity. You forfeit your agency. You become a spectator in your own life. You watch years pass without ever really showing up. And then one day you wake up and realize you've been rehearsing detachment so long that you've forgotten how to feel anything at all. This is the danger of passive nihilism. Not that it's philosophically wrong, but that it atrophies the capacity for care. And without that capacity, you're not free. You're just numb. Active nihilism, by contrast, requires something from you. It requires you to say, I choose this, not because it's objectively important, but because I've decided to make it important. And that decision, that act of will, is the only thing standing between you and total collapse. Now, Nietzsche doesn't sugarcoat how difficult this is. He knows that most people, when confronted with meaninglessness, will not rise to the occasion. They'll retreat into distraction, addiction, entertainment, work anything to avoid the confrontation. And he's not judging them for that. He's just noting that there's a difference between living in denial of meaninglessness and living in acceptance of it. Denial requires constant maintenance. You have to keep reinforcing the illusion that what you're doing matters in some cosmic sense. Acceptance, on the other hand, requires no maintenance. You know it doesn't matter, and you do it anyway, because mattering to you is enough. This shift from passive to active nihilism is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a daily choice to engage with life even when you can see through it. To love people even though they'll die. To create things even though they'll be forgotten. To seek beauty even though it's fleeting. And this practice doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you alive. Fully, consciously alive. In a way that passive nihilism can never quite reach. So the question Nietzsche leaves you with is simple. Not, does life have meaning? But, Are you willing to give it meaning anyway? And that question doesn't have a right answer. It just has your answer. And whatever you choose, you'll have to live with. Let's keep moving. Chapter 9, Nothingness and Consciousness. There's a moment that happens in deep meditation, or sometimes late at night when you're too tired to maintain your usual defenses. A moment when the boundary between self and world becomes thin, and for just a second you see it, the emptiness at the center. Not emotional emptiness, not depression or loneliness, but a fundamental emptiness, the recognition that consciousness is a process, not a thing. A stream of sensations, thoughts, memories, constantly arising and passing away. And beneath it all, nothing. No solid self holding it together. No unchanging essence watching from behind your eyes. Just awareness, flickering into existence moment by moment, and then dissolving again. This is what Buddhist philosophy calls emptiness, what existential phenomenology calls nothingness. And what happens when you encounter it is strange. At first, it feels like loss. Like you've been living your whole life, assuming you were a continuous, coherent person with a past and a future and an identity. And now that assumption is revealed to be a story, a useful fiction your brain constructs to navigate the world, but not the truth. The truth is more unsettling. You're not a thing that exists. You're a pattern that repeats, a habit of consciousness that your nervous system has learned to perform. And this realization can be destabilizing, because if there's no solid self, then who's making decisions? Who's experiencing suffering? Who's responsible for the life you've built? But here's the small detail that changes it. The absence of a solid self doesn't mean you don't exist. It just means you exist differently than you thought. You exist as process, as unfolding, as becoming. And this processual existence is actually more real than the static self you've been defending, because nothing in the universe is static. Everything is change. Rivers don't stay the same from one moment to the next. Mountains erode, stars collapse, bodies age. And consciousness is no different. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. Not metaphorically. Literally. Your cells have been replaced. Your memories have been reconsolidated. Your values have shifted. The only continuity is the story you tell about who you are. And that story is optional. This is where nihilism and Eastern philosophy converge, because both traditions point to the same insight. The self you think you are is not as real as it feels, and the meanings you think are inherent in the world are not as solid as they seem. Everything is more open, more fluid, more empty than the mind wants to admit. And this emptiness is not a problem to solve. It's a feature, because emptiness means possibility. If the self is not fixed, it can change. If meaning is not inherent, it can be created. If identity is not given, it can be chosen. This is the paradox of nothingness. It sounds like it should be terrifying, but for some people, it's the most liberating insight they've ever had. Because it means you're not trapped, not by your past, not by your conditioning, not by the story you've been telling yourself about who you have to be. You're free. Not free in the sense of having no constraints, but free in the sense that the constraints you thought were metaphysical are actually just psychological, and psychological constraints can be loosened. Now, this doesn't make life easier. In some ways, it makes it harder, because freedom is heavy. It's heavy precisely because there's no one else to blame. No fate, no destiny, no essential nature forcing you to be a certain way. Just you, constantly choosing who to become, moment by moment. And that choosing never stops. You don't arrive at a final self and rest there. You keep becoming. And the nothingness at the center, the emptiness that Buddhist meditators sit with for years, is the space where that becoming happens. It's the gap between one moment and the next. The pause between the inhale and the exhale. The silence between thoughts. And in that gap, everything is possible, including the possibility of letting go, of releasing the grip on the self you think you need to defend, of allowing the process to unfold without micromanaging every detail. This is what nihilism looks like when it stops being a crisis and starts being a practice, not a rejection of life, but a deeper engagement with life as it actually is, impermanent, groundless, empty, and, because of that emptiness, capable of holding anything. Let's sit with that for a moment before we move on. Chapter 10. Existential Anxiety. But here's what most people experience before they reach that quiet acceptance. Anxiety. Not the anxiety of specific threats, not the worry about deadlines or conflicts or health concerns. Something deeper. Existential anxiety. The anxiety that comes from being a self-aware creature in a universe that offers no reassurance. You know you're going to die. You know everyone you love is going to die. You know that everything you build will eventually crumble. And you know that the universe doesn't care. This knowledge sits in the background of your mind like a low-frequency hum. Most of the time, you don't notice it. You're distracted by the tasks of daily life, by the stories you tell yourself about meaning and progress and purpose. But sometimes, often at night, when the distractions fade, the hum gets louder, and you feel it, not as a thought, as a sensation, a tightness in your chest, a restlessness in your limbs, a feeling of being unmoored. Existential anxiety doesn't respond to logic. You can't reason your way out of it, because it's not based on a misunderstanding, it's based on a correct understanding, an understanding your body has before your mind can articulate it. The understanding that you are fundamentally alone, that no one can fully know what it's like to be you, that the boundary between self and other is absolute, that you will die alone even if you're surrounded by people, and that nothing you do can change this basic condition of existence. This is the terror that drives much of human behavior, the need for certainty, the need for connection, the need for distraction. We're all running, in one way or another, from the confrontation with existential aloneness. But here's the thing about running. It doesn't actually solve the problem. It just postpones the confrontation. And the postponement itself becomes a source of anxiety, because part of you knows you're avoiding something. And that knowing creates a background tension that never fully resolves. So, what do you do with existential anxiety? Most therapeutic approaches try to manage it. They give you coping strategies, breathing exercises, cognitive reframes, and those help to a degree. They lower the volume, but they don't address the root, because the root is not irrational. It's the appropriate response to an impossible situation. You're a finite being in an infinite universe. You have consciousness without knowing why. You have desires without knowing if they matter. You have relationships that will end, and you have to live with all of this every day while also getting out of bed and making breakfast and answering emails. It's absurd. And the anxiety you feel is your nervous system responding to that absurdity. Now, nihilism doesn't offer a cure, but it offers something else. Permission to stop pretending the anxiety is a mistake. Permission to see it as evidence that you're awake, that you're not numbing yourself with false certainty, that you're willing to look directly at the conditions of existence even when they're uncomfortable. And strangely, that permission can reduce the anxiety, not because the situation changes, but because you stop fighting it. You stop demanding that the universe be different than it is. You stop expecting peace to arrive from the resolution of an unresolvable problem. And in that surrender, not giving up, but giving in, the anxiety doesn't disappear. It just becomes part of the landscape, a reminder that you're alive, that you're conscious, that you still care enough to feel unsettled. And maybe that's all it's supposed to be, not a crisis to solve, but a signal that you're still engaged with the fundamental questions, still refusing to live on autopilot, still willing to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, and that willingness over time becomes its own kind of strength. Not the strength of certainty, but the strength of endurance, the strength to keep going even when the ground beneath you is uncertain, even when the future is opaque, even when the meaning you're building today might crumble tomorrow. This is the courage existential philosophy asks for, not the courage to conquer the anxiety, but the courage to live alongside it, to let it be there without letting it dictate your choices, to feel the groundlessness and step forward anyway. And that stepping forward, that daily choice to engage with life despite its uncertainty, is what transforms existential anxiety from a burden into a companion. Let's explore what that engagement looks like when suffering enters the picture. Chapter 11, Nihilism and Suffering. Here's where nihilism gets difficult, because suffering is real, not philosophically real, viscerally real. Pain, grief, betrayal, loss, the body breaking down, the mind unraveling, the heart closing off. And when you're in the middle of suffering, the philosophical question, does this mean anything, becomes urgent, not abstract. If the universe is indifferent, then your pain is just pain, not a test, not a lesson, not preparation for something greater, just pain happening to a conscious being in a universe that didn't arrange for it to happen and won't intervene to stop it. And that realization can make suffering unbearable, because part of what makes suffering tolerable is the belief that it serves a purpose, that it's building character, teaching you something. leading somewhere. But what if it's not? What if you're just hurting, and the hurt is meaningless, and it will keep happening until it doesn't, and then you'll die, and none of it will have mattered? This is the cruelest edge of nihilism, and it's where many people turn away. They can't hold both truths at once. That suffering is real, and that suffering is meaningless. So they choose one. Either they deny the meaninglessness and construct elaborate justifications for why they're suffering, or they deny the reality of suffering by numbing out, dissociating, pretending it's not that bad. But here's what nihilism asks of you. Don't choose. Hold both. Suffering is real, and suffering is meaningless. Not meaningless in the sense that it doesn't hurt, but meaningless in the sense that it's not orchestrated by a benevolent universe with your best interests in mind. It's just what happened. And this is where nihilism becomes almost unbearably honest, because it refuses to comfort you with stories that aren't true. It won't tell you that everything happens for a reason. It won't tell you that you're being tested. It won't tell you that the universe has a plan and your suffering is part of it. It will just sit with you in the pain and say, "This is hard, and it's not fair, and it's not leading anywhere." And somehow, for some people, that honesty is more comforting than false consolation. Because false consolation requires you to keep believing, to keep searching for the hidden meaning, to keep performing gratitude for lessons you haven't learned yet. But honest nihilism lets you stop performing. It lets you just hurt, without needing the hurt to be noble, without needing to extract wisdom from it, without needing to justify it to yourself or anyone else. And in that permission to just hurt, something loosens. The additional suffering you were creating by demanding that the suffering makes sense, that layer dissolves. You're left with the pain itself, still painful, still real, but no longer compounded by the expectation that it should mean something. This is what Buddhists call the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain itself, unavoidable. The second arrow is the story you tell about the pain, optional. Nihilism removes the second arrow, not by making you indifferent to suffering, but by releasing you from the obligation to make suffering meaningful, and paradoxically, that release can reduce the suffering, not always, not completely, but enough to breathe, enough to keep going. Now, this doesn't mean nihilism is a philosophy of passivity in the face of suffering. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to reduce suffering, yours or others. It just means you do it without the expectation that the universe will reward your effort. You help because you've decided helping is valuable to you, not because it's cosmically mandated, not because karma will balance the scales, but because suffering is real and you have the capacity to reduce it, and that's reason enough. This is active nihilism applied to compassion. You care because you choose to care, not because caring is objectively correct, but because indifference to suffering is a choice too, and you've chosen differently. And that choice, arbitrary, groundless, unsupported by any ultimate justification, is what gives your actions weight. Not metaphysical weight, human weight. The weight of a conscious being deciding what matters in a universe that offers no guidance. And maybe that's the only weight that ever mattered anyway. Let's continue. Chapter 12. Moral Emptiness. If meaning collapses, morality collapses with it. That's the fear. The fear that keeps people clinging to religious belief even when they've stopped believing. The fear that without God, without cosmic justice, without an objective standard of right and wrong, everything becomes permissible. And that fear is not irrational. Because for most of human history, morality has been grounded in metaphysics, in divine commandment, in natural law, in the structure of the universe itself. You don't steal because God forbids it. You don't kill because life is sacred. You don't lie because truth is a cosmic principle. Take away the cosmos, and what's left? Just preference, just social convention, just arbitrary rules we've agreed to follow because they make life easier. And if morality is just preference, then why should I follow your preferences instead of my own? This is the question Dostoevsky asked. If God does not exist, is everything permitted? And the honest answer is yes. Not in the sense that actions have no consequences, but in the sense that there's no cosmic authority preventing you from doing whatever you want. No divine judge, no karmic ledger, no moral law woven into the fabric of reality. Just you, your choices, and the consequences that follow. And this realization is terrifying, because most people have spent their entire lives assuming that morality is more than just human preference, that it's real in some deeper sense, that murder is wrong is not just an opinion, but a fact. But nihilism says, no, it's not a fact, it's a value. A value you hold, a value most people hold, a value societies have agreed to enforce, but not a fact. And this distinction between values and facts is where moral nihilism gets uncomfortable, because it means admitting that your deepest convictions are not objective truths, they're commitments, and commitments are fragile. They can be questioned, they can be revised, they can collapse under pressure. So what stops someone from abandoning morality entirely once they see it as groundless? Nothing, except the choice not to. This is where nihilism stops being a philosophy of ideas and becomes a philosophy of character. Because without external enforcement, without divine authority, without objective standards, morality becomes a test of who you are, not who you're supposed to be, who you actually are. What do you do when no one's watching? What do you do when you know you can get away with something? What do you do when the consequences of cruelty are minimal and the benefits are real? These questions are unbearable if you're waiting for the universe to tell you the right answer. But if you accept that the universe isn't going to tell you anything, the questions become simpler. Not easier, simpler. You do what you do, and you live with the consequences, and you build your character one choice at a time. Now, most people, when confronted with moral emptiness, don't become monsters. They don't start stealing and lying and murdering. They continue acting more or less the way they always have. Because morality isn't actually grounded in metaphysics. It's grounded in socialization, in empathy, in the practical benefits of cooperation. It's grounded in the fact that you live in a society with other people, and societies function better when people agree to certain norms. So even without God, even without objective moral truth, you still have reasons to be kind. Prudential reasons, social reasons, emotional reasons, just not cosmic reasons. And for some people, that's enough. They can live moral lives without needing morality to be more than human. But for others, it's not enough. They feel the absence. They feel like they're playing a game without believing in the rules. And that feeling of going through the motions of morality without the metaphysical backing is what moral emptiness feels like. Not evil, not cruelty, just hollowness. The sense that you're being good because it's expected, not because it's true. And that hollowness can be destabilizing, because it raises the question, if I'm only being good because it's expected, what happens when expectations change? What happens when being good stops serving me? What happens when cruelty becomes advantageous? Do I have any reason to resist? Nietzsche's answer was, yes, but only if you've decided to create reasons. Only if you've chosen values that you're willing to defend, even when they're inconvenient. Only if you've committed to a vision of who you want to be, not because the universe demands it, but because you demand it of yourself. This is moral autonomy, the terrifying, liberating recognition that you are the author of your own ethics, not discovering pre-existing moral truths, but creating moral commitments and then living by them. And that creation, that commitment, is what gives morality weight in a nihilistic universe. Not objective weight, but personal weight, the weight of integrity, of choosing to be a certain kind of person even when the universe offers no reward for that choice. And maybe that's the only morality that ever mattered. Not the morality of obedience, but the morality of character. The morality that says, this is who I am, this is what I stand for, and I'll stand for it even when it costs me. Let's keep going. Chapter 13, Freedom Without Meaning. Freedom sounds like it should feel good, like relief, like possibility, like the opening of a door you didn't know was locked. But existential freedom, the freedom that comes from realizing there's no cosmic script, often feels more like vertigo, like standing at the edge of a cliff with no railing. Because when you're truly free, you can't blame anyone. Not your parents, not society, not fate, not God. You can't say, I had no choice, because you always had a choice. You just didn't want to face the consequences of choosing differently. This is what Sartre meant when he said, man is condemned to be free, not blessed, condemned, because freedom is heavy. It means responsibility. It means that every moment of your life is the result of decisions you made or failed to make. It means you can't hide behind circumstances. It means you can't pretend you're just a passenger in your own life. You're the driver, and the road ahead is unmarked, and there's no GPS telling you where to go, just you deciding, moment by moment, which direction to turn. And every direction is equally valid or equally invalid from the universe's perspective. So, how do you choose? This is the paralysis of existential freedom, the paradox of infinite possibility. When everything is permitted, nothing feels compelling. When all choices are arbitrary, no choice feels worth making. So you freeze, or you default to whatever's easiest, or you let other people decide for you, because at least then you have someone to blame when it goes wrong. But here's the quiet layer beneath that. The paralysis isn't caused by too much freedom. It's caused by the expectation that freedom should come with instructions. That once you're free, you'll know what to do. But freedom doesn't work like that. Freedom is just the absence of constraint. It doesn't tell you what to want. It doesn't tell you what to value. It just gives you the space to figure it out for yourself. And figuring it out is the work. Not a one-time revelation, but a daily practice of choosing, reflecting, adjusting, choosing again. Most people never do this work. They inherit their values. They absorb them from culture, from family, from the stories they were told as children. And they live their entire lives according to those inherited values without ever asking, are these mine? Do I actually believe this? Or am I just performing belief because it's expected? Existential freedom asks you to examine those values, not to reject them necessarily, but to own them, to say, yes, I choose this, or no, I don't, and to accept the consequences of that choice. This is what makes freedom without meaning so difficult. It's not that there's no meaning. It's that the meaning is yours to create. And most people don't want that responsibility. They want the universe to tell them what matters. They want to discover their purpose, not invent it. But discovery requires something pre-existing. And purpose isn't pre-existing. It's emergent. It arises from the choices you make, the commitments you keep, the relationships you build. It's not out there waiting to be found. It's in here, waiting to be lived. And living it requires courage. The courage to commit to something without knowing if it's the right thing. The courage to build a life on foundations you know are arbitrary. The courage to care deeply about things that don't matter in any cosmic sense. This is the paradox of existential freedom. It gives you everything and nothing at the same time. Everything, because you're no longer constrained by invisible authorities. Nothing, because you're no longer supported by them either. You're alone with your freedom, and what you do with it is entirely up to you. Now, some people find this exhilarating. They thrive in the openness. They love the creativity, the autonomy, the sense of authorship over their own lives. But for others, it's crushing. They feel lost, unmoored, adrift, and they spend their lives searching for something to fill the void: work, relationships, ideologies, substances, anything to create the illusion of necessity. The illusion that they have to be doing what they're doing, but they don't. They're choosing it, and they could choose differently at any moment. And that truth is both the terror and the promise of existential freedom. You're not trapped, but you're also not guided. And navigating that space between terror and promise is the heart of what it means to live consciously in a nihilistic universe. Let's continue. Chapter 14, Absurdity of Existence. There's a French philosopher who spent his career thinking about one question. Not what is the meaning of life, but what do you do when you realize life has no meaning? His name was Albert Camus, and his answer was, you laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's absurd. Absurdity, for Camus, is the collision between two truths. The first truth: humans crave meaning. We can't help it. It's built into our psychology. We need stories. We need purpose. We need to believe that what we're doing matters. The second truth: the universe doesn't provide meaning. It's indifferent, silent, unresponsive. Put those two truths together and you get absurdity. A conscious being searching for meaning in a meaningless cosmos. It's like shouting into the void and expecting an answer. The void won't answer. It can't. But you keep shouting anyway. And that gap between the human need for meaning and the cosmic refusal to provide it is the absurd. Now, Camus didn't think this was a reason to give up. He thought it was a reason to keep going. Because the absurd, once you see it clearly, is a kind of freedom. If the universe doesn't care what you do, then you're free to do anything. If there's no cosmic judgment, then there's no cosmic failure. You can't get it wrong because there's no right way to do it. And that realization, paradoxically, removes the pressure. You're not trying to live up to some divine standard. You're not trying to fulfill some predetermined purpose. You're just living. And the fact that it doesn't mean anything doesn't make it less real. It makes it more real because you're not living for some future reward or some abstract ideal. You're living for the sake of living, for the texture of experience, for the sensation of being here, for the brief, strange gift of consciousness. Camus used a myth to illustrate this. The myth of Sisyphus. You probably know it. Sisyphus was a king who angered the gods and was punished with an eternal task. He had to push a boulder up a mountain, and every time he reached the top, the boulder would roll back down, and he'd have to start again forever. No progress, no escape, no resolution. Just the same meaningless task, repeated infinitely. It's a perfect image of the human condition. We work, we struggle, we build things, and then we die, and it all disappears. And the next generation does the same thing. And it keeps going. No ultimate purpose. No final victory. Just the cycle. So, what does Sisyphus do? According to Camus, he accepts it. He stops waiting for the task to end. He stops hoping for rescue. He stops searching for meaning in the boulder. And instead, he finds meaning in the act itself, in the pushing, in the effort, in the defiance. He says to the gods, "You gave me this task to break me, but I won't break. I'll keep pushing, not because I think it matters, but because I choose to, and in that choice, he wins, not by escaping the absurd, but by embracing it, by finding dignity in the struggle itself." This is Camus' answer to nihilism. Don't deny the meaninglessness. Don't try to escape it with false consolations. Just accept it. And then live anyway, fully, passionately, defiantly. Not because life has meaning, but because life is all you have, and that's enough. Now, this might sound like resignation, like giving up on the possibility of real meaning, but Camus didn't see it that way. He saw it as liberation, because once you stop demanding that life provide meaning, you can start creating meaning on your own terms. You can pursue beauty without needing it to be eternal. You can love people without needing the love to be cosmically significant. You can work on projects without needing them to change the world. You can just be. And that, being that simple, defiant presence in the face of absurdity, is its own form of resistance. A resistance against despair, against passivity, against the temptation to give up just because the universe doesn't care. Camus called this revolt, not political revolt, but existential revolt, the refusal to accept despair as the final answer, the choice to live fully even when you know it's futile. And that choice, repeated every day, is what makes life worth living. Not because it leads somewhere, but because it is, right here, right now, in this moment, which is all you ever have anyway. Let's keep going. Chapter 15. Art after meaning. When meaning collapses, art changes. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly you start to see it. In the paintings that stop trying to represent something sacred and start exploring what it feels like to be uncertain. In the music that stops resolving into harmony and stays suspended in dissonance. In the literature that stops offering closure and leaves you hanging in ambiguity. This is art after the death of God. Art that no longer believes it's channeling something eternal. Art that knows it's arbitrary, fleeting, groundless, and creates anyway. Because what else is there to do? Think about abstract expressionism, Rothko's color fields, Pollock's splatters. No figures, no narrative, no recognizable content, just sensation. The experience of looking. The confrontation between a conscious being and a surface that refuses to mean anything beyond itself. It's art that mirrors the absurd. It gives you nothing to hold on to. No story, no symbol, no message. Just the experience of being present with something that won't explain itself. And for some people, that's unbearable. They look at a Rothko and say, my kid could do that. They look at a Pollock and see chaos, because they're still looking for meaning, still expecting art to deliver something beyond the encounter itself. But post-meaning art doesn't deliver. It just is. And in that refusal to deliver, it becomes honest. It stops pretending it has access to transcendence. It stops pretending it can save you. It just offers you an experience, beautiful or ugly or somewhere in between, and lets you decide what to do with it. This same shift happens in music. Think about Schoenberg, Cage, minimalism, music that abandons tonality, abandons resolution, abandons the expectation that a piece should build to a satisfying conclusion. Instead, it gives you patterns that repeat, sounds that decay, silences that stretch. It forces you to sit with discomfort, to question what you're even listening for. And in that questioning, something shifts. You stop waiting for the music to give you meaning, and you start noticing what it's like to just listen, without agenda, without expectation. Just the raw encounter between sound and ear. And that encounter, stripped of narrative, stripped of purpose, becomes its own kind of meditation, a practice of presence in the absence of resolution. The same thing happens in literature. Beckett, Kafka, Camus, stories that refuse to resolve. characters who don't grow or change or learn lessons. Plots that circle back to where they started, or dissolve into fragments, or simply stop without concluding. It's literature that mirrors the human condition. We don't grow in neat art. Our problems don't resolve cleanly. Our lives don't have satisfying endings, they just end. And post-meaning literature refuses to lie about that. It won't give you closure if life doesn't give you closure. It won't give you meaning if meaning isn't inherent in the experience. It will just show you what it's like to be here. Confused, searching, often alone. And somehow, for some readers, that honesty is more meaningful than any fabricated resolution could be. Because it validates the experience. It says, yes, this is what it's like. You're not missing something. This is it. Now, this doesn't mean all modern art is nihilistic, but there's a thread of nihilistic honesty running through it. A willingness to work without metaphysical support. To create without believing creation is cosmically important. To make beauty without believing beauty redeems suffering. And that willingness is itself a form of courage, because it's easier to make art that promises meaning, that offers hope or resolution or transcendence. Art that tells people what they want to hear. But post-meaning art does something harder. It refuses to comfort. It refuses to lie. It just presents the encounter between you and the work and lets you sit with whatever arises. And in that sitting, something unexpected can happen. Not meaning, but presence. A heightened awareness of being here, now, in this moment, which might be the only meaning that ever existed anyway. Not imposed from above, but arising from attention, from the simple act of showing up, fully, honestly, without armor. This is what art becomes in a nihilistic age. Not a consolation, but a mirror. A mirror that shows you yourself, stripped of the stories you tell to make existence tolerable. And in that stripping, paradoxically, you might find something more real than any story could provide. Let's keep going. Chapter 16. Psychological effects of nothing. So what does all of this do to the mind? Not the philosophical mind, the actual mind. The nervous system trying to navigate a world where meaning is optional and death is inevitable. The psychological effects of confronting meaninglessness are not trivial. They're visceral. For some people, the confrontation leads to depression. Not sadness, not grief, but a flattening of affect, a loss of motivation. A sense that nothing is worth doing because nothing ultimately matters. Why get out of bed? Why work? Why connect? Why try? If it's all going to dissolve anyway, why bother? This is the depressive response to nihilism, and it's common. Because the mind needs goals to function. It needs forward momentum, even if that momentum is illusory. Take away the illusion, and the momentum stops. The person is left in a kind of psychological stasis, not actively suffering, just not engaging, going through the motions but never fully present. For others, the confrontation leads to anxiety. The anxiety of infinite choice. The anxiety of no guidance. The anxiety of being responsible for a life that has no predetermined shape. This is the anxious response to nihilism. And it's equally common, because freedom without meaning feels like falling. The mind keeps reaching for something to hold on to, a value, a purpose, a narrative, but nothing sticks. Everything feels conditional, temporary, groundless, and the nervous system, which evolved to seek stability, goes into overdrive trying to find something solid. But there's nothing solid. Just the constant awareness that you're making it all up as you go. And that awareness, sustained over time, can be exhausting. Then there's a third response, disassociation, a kind of psychic numbing where the person stops feeling much of anything. Not because they're depressed, but because feeling requires caring, and caring requires believing that what you care about matters. And if nothing matters, then caring becomes painful. So the mind protects itself by shutting down. Emotions become muted. Relationships become transactional. Experience becomes flat. It's a survival strategy, a way of living in a meaningless world without constantly confronting the meaninglessness. But it's also a form of death, not physical death, but the death of aliveness, the death of the capacity to be moved, to be surprised, to be present. And once you're in that state, it's hard to get out, because getting out requires re-engaging with the vulnerability of caring. And caring in a meaningless universe feels like setting yourself up for disappointment. So what's the alternative? How do you confront meaninglessness without falling into depression, anxiety, or disassociation? Camus said, "You don't avoid the confrontation, you stay in it. You let the absurd be absurd. You let the meaninglessness be meaningless, and you find a way to live that doesn't require meaning to be pre-given." This is the psychological work of nihilism, not denying the problem, but learning to live with it. Learning to create meaning in real time, moment by moment, without needing it to be validated by anything outside yourself. And this learning is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a daily practice of choosing what to care about, of deciding what's worth your attention, of building a life that feels coherent to you, even if it's not coherent to the universe. And slowly, over time, the psychological effects shift. The depression lifts not because you've found ultimate meaning, but because you've stopped demanding it. The anxiety eases not because you've found certainty, but because you've made peace with uncertainty. The disassociation fades not because you've protected yourself from pain, but because you've decided pain is worth risking for the sake of aliveness. And what emerges is something unexpected. Not happiness necessarily, but vitality. A kind of fierce engagement with life that doesn't need life to be anything other than what it is. Temporary, groundless, absurd, and yet worth showing up for. This is the psychological transformation nihilism can offer, not as a destination, but as a process. A process of learning to be here fully without needing here to be perfect. Let's move towards something quieter now. Chapter 17, Peace in Emptiness. There's a paradox at the heart of nihilism. The more you let go of meaning, the more peaceful you become. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop demanding that your caring be cosmically validated. You stop waiting for the universe to confirm that you're on the right path. You stop needing your suffering to serve a purpose. You stop performing significance. And in that release, something softens. The grip loosens. The background tension you've been carrying for years, the tension of trying to live up to an invisible standard, dissolves. Because there is no standard, there never was. You made it up, or you inherited it, or you absorbed it from culture. But it was never real in the way you thought it was real. And once you see that, you can put it down. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but gently, the way you'd put down a heavy bag after carrying it for miles. You don't hate the bag. You're not rejecting it. You're just done carrying it. And the relief is immediate. Your shoulders drop. Your breathing deepens. Your mind clears. Not because you've solved anything, but because you've stopped trying to solve the unsolvable. This is the peace that comes from embracing emptiness. Not the emptiness of depression, but the emptiness of spaciousness. The emptiness that allows things to move through you without getting stuck. You feel anger, and then it passes. You feel grief, and then it passes. You feel joy, and then it passes. And you stop clinging to any of it. You stop trying to make the joy last forever. You stop trying to fix the grief immediately. You just let it be what it is for as long as it lasts, and then let it go. And this letting go becomes a kind of meditation, a practice of non-attachment, not detachment, which implies coldness, but non-attachment, which allows for full engagement without grasping. You can love someone deeply without needing the love to be eternal. You can work on something passionately without needing it to change the world. You can care about your life without needing your life to matter in any cosmic sense. And this is where nihilism and Buddhism converge. Both traditions point to the same insight. Clinging is suffering. Clinging to beliefs, clinging to identity, clinging to meaning. The tighter you hold, the more you suffer. Because everything you're holding is slipping away. Your body is aging, your relationships are changing, your certainties are dissolving. You can fight it, but you won't win. Or you can release the grip and see what happens. And what happens, for many people, is peace. Not the peace of arrival, but the peace of surrender, the peace that comes from no longer resisting what is. You stop arguing with reality. You stop demanding that life be fair or meaningful or comprehensible. You just let it be what it is. Messy, contradictory, often painful, and also occasionally beautiful. Occasionally tender. Occasionally worth every ounce of struggle. And you hold both, the pain and the beauty, the meaninglessness and the preciousness, the absurdity and the grace. You hold all of it without needing to reconcile it, without needing it to add up to something coherent. And in that holding, you find a strange kind of stability. Not the stability of certainty, but the stability of acceptance. The stability of knowing that whatever comes, you'll meet it. Not because you're strong, but because you've stopped fighting. And in that not fighting, you become unshakable. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because you're no longer defending against hurt. You're just here, open, present, alive. And that presence, in and of itself, is the peace you've been searching for. Not out there, not in some future resolution, but here, now, in the emptiness that holds everything. Let's move into silence now. Chapter 18, Silence, Sleep, and Nothingness. And so we return to where we started. The quiet room, the low lights, the moment when the day finally goes still and your mind, no longer distracted, begins to wander. But now, maybe, you understand why. The mind wanders because it's searching, not for answers, but for permission to stop searching, permission to rest in the not knowing, to let the questions dissolve without demanding resolution. This is what nihilism offers at its quietest. Not a philosophy to debate, but a practice of release, a practice of noticing the weight you've been carrying and gently setting it down. The weight of needing life to mean something. The weight of needing your choices to be cosmically correct. The weight of needing the universe to validate your existence. You can put it down now, not because you've given up, but because you've seen through it. You've seen that the universe was never going to give you what you were waiting for. And that's okay, because what you were waiting for, meaning, purpose, certainty, was never out there. It was always something you were doing. And you can keep doing it if you want, or you can stop, or you can do something else entirely. The choice is yours, and the universe won't judge. It can't. It's just here, unfolding, indifferent to your struggle and your peace in equal measure. And in that indifference, there's a kind of mercy, because it means you can't fail. There's no standard you're falling short of. No cosmic expectation you're disappointing. No ultimate judgment waiting at the end. Just this breath, this moment, this brief window of consciousness. And when it ends, when the body stops and the mind dissolves and the story you've been telling yourself finally goes quiet, there will be nothing. Not as punishment, not as reward, just nothing. The same nothing that was here before you arrived. The same nothing that holds everything. And maybe that's the most comforting truth of all, that you came from nothing and you'll return to nothing, and in between you had this strange, improbable experience of being someone, of seeing color and feeling warmth and knowing love. And it didn't have to mean anything for it to be real. It was just real, and that was enough. So as you lie here now, letting your body settle into rest, let that be enough. You don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't have to figure out the meaning of your life before you fall asleep. You just have to breathe and let the breath carry you down into the quiet, into the emptiness that isn't empty, into the nothingness that holds everything you've ever been. Notice your shoulders dropping. Notice the weight of your body where it meets the surface beneath you. Notice the space between one thought and the next. That space is always there. It's been there your whole life. You've just been too busy filling it to notice. But tonight, you can let it be. You can let the silence speak. You can let the nothingness hold you. And you can rest, not because you've earned it, not because the universe has granted permission, but because rest is what happens when you stop resisting, when you stop demanding that sleep come with a purpose, when you let your mind drift without needing to control where it goes. And as you drift, maybe you notice something, The thoughts that felt so urgent an hour ago are already fading. The questions that felt so pressing are losing their grip. And what's left is just the quiet room, the soft, dark, the gentle rhythm of breathing. No meaning, no purpose, no grand narrative, just this. And this, it turns out, is all there ever was. This moment, endlessly repeating, endlessly dissolving. This brief flash of awareness in an otherwise silent universe. And you got to be here for it. You got to witness it. You got to feel it. And soon, you'll let it go. Not because you're giving up, but because holding on was never the point. The point, if there ever was one, was just to be here, fully, briefly, honestly, and then to return to the silence from which you came. So let yourself return now. Let the thoughts slow. Let the body soften. Let the mind dissolve into the nothingness that was always waiting. Not as an ending, but as a homecoming to the quiet, to the emptiness, to the peace that doesn't need a reason. You're safe here. You've always been safe, and as you drift into sleep, know this. The nothing that's waiting isn't something to fear. It's something you've been carrying inside you all along. And tonight, you get to rest in it, completely. Finally, at peace, sleep well.